You may be familiar with the saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. It is, of course, literally probably not terribly true, but anecdotally true nonetheless. The point of it being that when people find themselves in times of crisis, they often turn to faith. And I propose coining a new phrase this evening, which you'll find not quite so catchy, but which I hope has the same analogous power, which is that you will find no denominationalists in time of church crisis. It may not be quite so catchy, and I suspect it won't have such global appeal, but the power is the same, the point that it's trying to make, that if there are no atheists in foxholes in time of crisis in warfare, then you won't find any who stick to one particular denomination or another in time of church crisis. Again, not strictly true, I'm sure, but anecdotally so, and I will offer you such anecdotes now. When I was working in the United States, over in Oakland, I was working with a priest called Father Christian. He was a Liberian priest, and he had lived through the Liberian Civil War as an Anglican minister in the 90s. Those of you who know that part of the world and that piece of history will know that the most violent and bloody act of terror during that war was the killing of 600 people in a Lutheran church. And religion became very politicized during that conflict, and church leaders were often those who were sought out, whose lives were sought out for political gain. And the community to which Father Christian was ministering, the Roman Catholic priest had fled because his life had been told to him that it was forfeit, and the Methodist minister had fled, and the Baptist pastor had fled, and the Lutheran minister had left as well. And so Father Christian's Sunday routine became the following. At 8 a.m. he would go to the Roman Catholic Church where he would celebrate the Mass. At 9 o'clock he went to his Anglican church where he celebrated the Communion. Then he would go on to the Baptist church where he'd give an hour-long sermon for them. And then at lunchtime he'd go on to the Lutherans, and he'd finish up with the Methodists for their evening service. When I was ministering in Epping, my church prior to this one, on Good Friday we would do a walk of witness through the town. We'd gather at one end, we'd process through the town over the course of an hour, and we'd stop every 150 yards or so, and we'd do another little diorama of one piece of the Passion narrative. And we gathered together as all of the churches, 7 or 8 of them in Epping, to do it. And I'm sure that if you asked those of us who were there why we did so, we would tell you that we were theologically committed to the unity of the churches, that this was our opportunity to express such unity to our wider community. But underneath that idealism, I suspect that the real reason that we started asking the other churches whether they would like to be involved in our walk of witness was because we were running a bit thin on actors for the little vignettes that we were performing, and we thought that the Baptists down the road with rather more younger people might be able to supply a few. And this, I think, is broadly true of a lot of the church's unity work, that it comes out of necessity and pragmatism, and then we cover it by saying that we are theologically and idealistically committed to unity. The thing you'll notice about both of those stories is that the Christians in Father Christian's community in Liberia, they didn't suggest to him that they all gather at one church and have a single service, but they were willing for him, not a Catholic priest, nor ordained in the Lutheran church or the Methodists or the Baptists, to lead each of their individual communities for them and to offer them what they were looking for in worship. And if you went back to Epping on Easter Sunday, on the third day, 2 days after our United Good Friday Walk of Witness, you would find each of our congregations celebrating Easter Sunday in each of our own churches, none of us venturing to one another. And that's not a problem, I don't think, because the point of unity is not uniformity or conformity. The point of unity is not to shrink down our expressions of faith, the different ways that we worship, the style that we do things in. And that is because, as precious as worship style can be to us, it is essentially a thing which is inconsequential. What I have never come across in any of the churches that I've worked or worshipped in is somebody who said to me, I really hate the organ and I despise the kind of teaching that you do from the pulpit and I can't stand a robed choir, but I come along because I think it's what God likes and it's the right way of doing things. Or indeed, when I was a younger child in a Baptist church and we had drums and electric guitars and 40-minute sermons, nobody there ever said to me, this is not at all how I would choose to worship, but I'm coming along anyway because I am convicted and convinced that it's right nonetheless. People you will find go to churches which offer worship that suits them. And that's fine, because God is not so fickle as to prefer Baroque music over Christian rock. You may find this difficult to believe, but he is a deeply mysterious divinity, and with him all things are possible. And unity, we should not confuse ourselves to think that it is somehow about finally settling this age-old debate over whether guitar or organ is the appropriate instrument on which to worship. Unity doesn't even mean enjoying the expressions of worship that our brothers and sisters engage in. It doesn't mean being piously nice. It doesn't mean that we have to stop telling the jokes that we tell about ourselves and about other denominations, as long as they're not meant spitefully and as long as they don't tear down. But unity, nevertheless, is something that we must strive for, because it's something that Christ speaks to his disciples at the Last Supper. Father, let them be one, as you and I are one, that the world may know. And it is something that he exemplifies in his own life. We worship a Trinitarian God, a God who is necessarily in relationship, one with the other, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and who exemplifies not disunity, but perfect unity in love. The problem, I think, that stops us from engaging more in acts of unity with other churches is that it doesn't seem on the surface that it costs very much to not bother. I have done very little in the way of church unity in the last year, and sure enough as it did last year, so the week of prayer for Christian unity has rolled around this year, and I'll give another sermon on it. And if I do no acts of Christian unity in the year to come, I'm sure that this week will come again next year, and I'll offer you another sermon. It doesn't seem to cost us anything, and in fact, it saves us a whole lot of bother. All of those churches and their traditions and their practices that slightly rile me up and make me feel uncomfortable, that make me erupt in a nuisance, I don't have to deal with any of them if I never go to see them, if I never engage with them, if I never speak to them. But of course, there is a cost. It's a bit like that family member at Christmas, and I'm sure some of you, this memory will be very alive for you from only a month ago. And you know that you really must invite your great Aunt Wendy, and you know that just like last year, she'll turn to your cousin and she'll say to him, "Where are you from, darling?" And he'll say, "I'm from Brixton." And she'll say, No, where are your parents from?" And he'll say, "Well, they're from Brixton as well." And she'll say, No, I mean, where are you really from? And you know that you'll have to engage with that, and that it will throw up animosity, and that it's a nuisance, and that Heads will butt against one another, and it's just easier. You just wish, couldn't for just one Christmas we do it on our own and not have to face all of this. And that's how our acts of unity as Christian churches can sometimes feel. It's easier when we just go it on our own, and it doesn't seem to cost anything to do so. And that's quite true for places like this that are well-resourced, where we can put on everything we want to put on, where we're not facing that pressure or that crisis that causes us to work more closely together. But even here, there is a cost, and it is the damage that we do to the church and to one another. We damage the way that the world sees the church. Look at these Christians who can't even get on with one another, who are arguing over things that we couldn't even care about and we don't understand. And we do damage to the body of Christ internally. I've been watching that BBC adaptation of Northern Lights, one of the books that I loved as a child, Philip Pullman's series, his trilogy. And I'm a couple of episodes behind, so I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone, but there's a scene where the human children are being cut away with this sort of guillotine machine from their little animal companions that run around with them, who are sort of their spirit animals, basically. And there's this scene where one of the child is put into a cage and this little animal put into another cage, and they're separated by this guillotine that's going to come down and slice them apart. And there's this great horror and fear that's part of it. And that is what we do to the body of Christ when we fail to act in ways of unity, when we tear apart that which should be one. We live in brokenness, in damaged relationship. And the problem is that we can't accept that if we are to be the disciples that Christ calls us to be. Because God's kingdom is meant to be different from the way of this world. And if we accept those broken relationships, person to person and person to God, then all we do is conform to the ways of the world. If we fail to engage with one another, if we fail to seek Christian unity actively, then we just perpetuate and condone what already exists. But we are called to act differently, to show another way, to act in the way of God's kingdom. So this is my plea to you, as someone who's not been very good at Christian unity, and may find himself standing here again in a year's time, preaching a similar sermon and confessing once again to not being very good at Christian unity. This is my plea to you, to engage actively in these days and these weeks ahead, and to seek to live out a life that looks more like God's kingdom than the broken ways of this world.